So far, we've looked at CSS transitions and CSS animations, but another really powerful feature is the ability to transform your content using a series of transform functions. Now, these are available in both 2D and 3D. Now, the support for the 2D ones is pretty good right now. The 3D ones are still kind of a work in progress in a lot of browsers. Again, you can check that Can I Use website for the most up-to-date data about which browsers support which. But I'm on the Mozilla documentation for CSS here. I just want to cover and go over what some of the transform functions are available. And you can see they're in this right-hand navigation. So we have the ability to transform via a matrix. So again, if you've been doing Flash development and you're used to matrix transforms, you're going to easily be able to do this. So they come in both matrix and matrix 3D. We're able to rotate an element, rotate with 3D. And then we also have individual rotation functions for each axis. So we have rotate X, rotate Y, rotate Z. So we can scale on all the axes. We can skew across them. We have translate functions available. So again, we can use these also in conjunction with CSS transitions. And that's what I'm going to show you how to do right now. So I'm going to jump over to Sublime Text, and I have just a simple page set up with a div with an ID of box. I've set the width and the height to 200 pixels, the position to absolute, and that way we can easily animate it around the screen. So what I'm going to do is come down in here, and again, since these are new CSS3 features, we need to use vendor-specific prefixes. I'm going to use WebKit because, again, I'm in a WebKit-based browser. So what I'm going to do is to set the transform property. And to this property, I can call as many of those transform functions that I just showed you that I want if I want to do multiple transforms. So what I'm going to do is to first call the translate transform function. And this allows me to move, and essentially translate is just a fancy word for moving something to a different position. So I'm going to move it to 500 pixels on the x-axis and 0 pixels on the y-axis. And this is essentially adding 500 pixels to the x-axis. So I'm going to come under here and add a couple of other transform functions. The next one I'm going to add is the rotate. And to this, I pass in a value in degrees. So I'm going to pass in 30 DEG for degrees. Now you'll notice that I'm using just the 2D transforms at the moment. And the last one I'm going to put in is the scale transform function. I'm going to scale it to be 2 times on the x-axis, and let's make it 5 times on the y-axis. So again, all of these functions are now going to be applied to this box. So let's jump over to Chrome and we'll look at this. I'll refresh. And now you can see what's happened is it's rotated this div, it's scaled it, and it's translated. So that's pretty cool. But what if we actually wanted to trigger this with a transition? So what I'm going to do is to add a transition tag here. So again, it's going to be WebKit-transition. And I'm going to have it transition all CSS properties. And I'm going to have it take 1 second to do that. And then what I'm going to do is to copy this transform block that we wrote to the clipboard, remove it from the box definition, and put it in the hover selector for my box. So I'm going to create another CSS rule here for the hover and paste in that transform code. That basically means that anytime this transform happens, it's actually going to transition that over time. So let's go back and look at that. As soon as I put my mouse on, we can see it's now transitioned, and those transitions are happening, again, all of those. So it's translating, it's rotating, and it's scaling up that div. So again, that's a 2D transformation. Let's look at how to do it with the actual 3D transformations. So I'll go back. So I'm going to keep the translation the same, except I'm actually going to move it 300 pixels more on the y-axis. Then I'm going to change this to a 3D specific rotation. I'm going to say rotate Y to 30 degrees. And then down here, I'm going to say rotate X, which is going to rotate it on the X-axis. I'm going to make that go to 120 degrees. So now I'm using some of the 3D transformations. So let's go back and refresh this. And now you can see what's happening is this thing is actually rotating around in 3D now using some of those 3D transformations. And this is really easy stuff when you think about it compared to what it would take to do this in other technologies. And remember, we haven't had to write a single line of JavaScript code here. This is just using purely CSS. Now, one thing I did want to point out is in some browsers right now, well, in many browsers actually, these transformations can be hardware accelerated, which allows you to use these things on mobile devices. But there are some browsers that kind of need to be coerced into hardware accelerating them. And the way in which you can do that is actually to say WebKit-transform, and then just give it one of the 3D properties. So let's say I don't actually want to rotate on the Z-axis, but I can just say rotate Z 0 degrees. And just by the fact of putting that will actually hardware accelerate any CSS transforms that you do. Now, this is expected that you won't have to do this for very much longer. But again, this is just a little trick to coerce the browser into making sure that it hardware accelerates any transforms that it does.